Welcome everybody. Steve with Sensus Fidelium coming at you with, we're going to talk shop today, or shop talk, or it's a play on words for the book, Shop Talk, that Father Ripperger put together in memory of his dad. Anyways, Father, thank you for coming on. How you doing? Good morning.
Thanks for having me on, Steve. I'm actually not doing too bad. So all things considered, ready for summer. So that's good.
I got my morning coffee, and we just had a little round of summer last week. It was back in the spring, and I think summer's taking 2 more weeks to come down here in the dirty South. But the strawberries are doing just fine.
Oh, there you go. I keep forgetting that as you held up your drink, I told the guy that sells the mugs, like sin make you stupid and all that I would actually, there you go. So yeah, I told him we would hold that up to try and boost his sales a little bit. So, but which is good because on that particular thing, all the money goes towards our chapel. So
we don't do any placement of merchandise in here at all.
Yeah. Yeah, and usually, when it comes to podcasts, I usually like to just do straight interviews. But in this particular case, this is actually when people read the book, they'll see the why I'm actually wanted to kind of promote this just a little bit. So
what would be the genesis? What was the idea that brought this up? I'm obviously sure your dad passed away a couple months ago.
Just about a year. Well, it's a little less than a year ago. So, basically, the genesis of it was, just living through this experience of actually working as a mechanic with my father for off and on in the summer times. And even as a priest, I worked a little bit before him just to kind of get him caught up. This was for about 25 years. I actually worked. I take that back. Now that I think about it, it would have been 22 years, 24. No, that's right. About 25 years. So it would have been 25 years I worked off and on for a priest. Worked for him as a mechanic. Much more when I was younger, and then and in college, and then once I got ordained, less so. But I would still work for him even then. But it was just observing and learning so much at their shop because there were so many things. And it was over the course of about 5 to 10 years into being a priest, I began to realize that the formation I got under my father at the shop was very key in understanding just how things work, how people work, how society works, and what basic common sense is and things of this sort, and the desire that we have for clarity about certain matters. And so my dad and I would talk from time to time just about things that had happened in the past. And then about 3 years before he died, he and I were talking one day, and how I told him, I was trying to get my dad to actually think about kind of putting his stuff for our family's sake, if nothing else, about his experience growing up and things like that. But then we ended up talking about a lot of the things that happened at the shop that were very revelatory about how things work. Because I think a lot of times today we look at people and we realize they have no common sense, they have no ability to grasp the natures of things anymore. And so we kind of talked off and on up until he died. And then about a year before he started dying, I started keeping notes of stories that I thought, these would be good stories for people to have, and the morals behind the stories, because certain things happened. But then there were real morals to the story, both intellectual and even spiritual, theologically even, but also just basic philosophical principles would come into play. And so I thought, so after he died, I thought, while it's still fresh in my mind, because my dad and I had, like I said, had talked off and on before he passed, that, I'm going to do it now while it's still fresh in my mind. So that's kind of the genesis of the thing.
Yeah, for anybody, I guess, older than, we'll say 40, you remember the times where the garages were almost on every street. I remember Cowpen, South Carolina, we had a guy down the street. We gave him I remember Dad paying with a 12-pack of beer one time to check out the car. Those relationships like that you're talking about, the small town feel, things like there's no TV, you had TV, but no one's glued to it. You didn't have the internet going. You had the personal connections that were face to face.
Yeah, and that's very true in my dad's shop. In fact, it's kind of funny. You pay him to look at the thing through a 6 or a 12-pack, one time, this one guy who was a regular customer of ours, he couldn't pay his bill, so he asked my dad, "Well, would you take a 357 for the bill?" And my dad said, "Yeah, I'll take a 357 for it." So he ended up paying my dad, but by giving him a 357, which is, was a great gun. It was in good shape.
And I guess, I'm doing this. I mean, it's not my dad. He ran a bowling center, so we were in the back of the bowling centers watching the machinery do this and help it, breaking up pin jams, and you were in the shop and you do, helping your dad doing stuff like that. So we grew up doing things that, I was cooking in the kitchen when I was 12. But my kid isn't doing stuff like we are. So, or
That's
that
right.
I did growing up. It's a different generation. I mean, like I said, you were formed doing hard labor in a sense compared to now.
Yeah, and that comes out in the thing is not just my dad working hard, but I working hard under him and watching my father, how hard he worked in order to provide for our family. But I think that's really true. In fact, that's actually, there's a one part in the book where I actually talk about how one of the difficulties that you actually see among young men specifically is you'll see somebody who's a guy who's like 20, 25, and they've never had to do anything that requires any kind of physicality to it, like mechanical work or woodwork, or like you said, unjamming certain things, just working with things. They've never had to do that. And so they don't even know how to use a basic set of tools. They literally do not even know how to hold a screwdriver properly to maximize torque. And so when they have to try and do something, they'll go on YouTube, they'll look at it, and then they think they're going to replicate it. And it doesn't turn out quite the way they had expected or what have you. But it's what I learned through that process and observing just different people who had yours and my experience, and then people who didn't have their experience, that by the time they reach 20 to 25, the brain, we already know this from brain science, the brain is already kind of set. And so what happens is if they don't learn how to use the basic set of tools before then, it's never going to happen in their life, in the sense that they're never going to become really, really good at it or proficient at it. And I think that the compartmentalizing of our culture or our society, where a part of it has to do with affluence, but because when we grew up, we were lower middle class. So if you wanted anything, you had to go work for it. Whereas today, kids, everything's kind of taken care of for them, or at least we kind of have that mindset of we just take care of everything for them rather than getting them involved in actually working. And in my day and age, you had to work. My father needed us to actually work at a certain stage. I mean, when I first started working, I didn't need to be working there. But when as we got older, he became somewhat dependent on us because his business was so overloaded during certain times of the year that we just had to be there to help him out. But I realized in retrospect that it was actually, I learned a tremendous amount about just how to use tools, how things work, how materials work, how certain materials have certain tensile strengths, all that type of thing. I learned, which today kids don't have any clue. So if something breaks down, they just stand there and call somebody to come and change their tire, for example.
Yeah, I remember being in Denver one time. Well, when we were living back out there, and my wife wanted me to, why don't you get a beard? I go, I can't look like these people out here. The guys walk around in beards thinking they're men. They don't even know how to change a tire. I'm the opposite, dude. The opposite what these guys are. It's all about Instagram. What it's generational too. One of the stories popped in my head about it. Alex Rodriguez going up I think it was Willie Mays asking, what'd you work on in the off season? What kind of workouts you did? He goes, workouts, dude. I worked. Even guys, even the pro players who didn't get paid millions back then, maybe they were middle. Those guys didn't get paid that back then. They actually had jobs. I think DiMaggio worked for his dad's fishing company in the off season. So it's like a mindset today we don't know anything about.
Yeah, exactly. Although if the economy implodes, we'll be right back to where that is. There'll be a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth because people just aren't accustomed to it. They're not, and that's actually the real kind of theme of the book is how working like we did, how that actually forms a person's mental habits and also just their moral habits. And we just were not seeing that among the young kids today. And so, but that's actually the idea behind the book was to actually provide part of that. The other side of it is too, is this, there's bits and pieces about what it really means to be a man, right? I mean, the ability to, that kind of that self-sufficiency, that ability to fix pretty much anything if you need to. I talked about that a little bit in the book, is the necessity to have kind of a generalized knowledge. Any guy who gets married should be able to do basic repair around the house. If he can't, and he has to hire every single thing out, that's a problem.
Almost like just it's innate in guys anyways. Like my son will see me with the power drill, and he immediately wants to find something in there that looks like it to get right next to me and start doing it too.
Yeah,
or a hammer. He sees me hammering away. So he grabs something. Can I help out? Even if it's a toy rubber hammer, he's beating on that nail.
Yeah, and I think that's, I kind of do talk about this in here, is that, you know, just as a normal guy, because we are ordered as men towards the, you know, to be able to work, that's because that's our function. That's what God assigned us in the book of Genesis. So our job is to work, right? And so that implies, though, that in order to do the work, that God gave us an inclination to basically want to use tools and things of that sort. So a normal guy loves tools. And in fact, once you get really good at using tools, there's no tool that you wouldn't mind owning, you know, that kind of a thing. And the difficulty is today, though, is that because kids have never used tools and they don't know how to use tools, and quite frankly, they're too lazy to use a tool, the men have no interest in the tools, which is really odd, or they'll have just like a minimum amount of tools. But anyway, yeah, we just, as guys, we want to be able to, and you see this, like you said, even among kids, they want to get in there and actually do those things that involve tools if they're normal, you know. But I think that St. Thomas says something fascinating. He says that the natural inclinations become occluded, that is clouded, or basically blocked or mitigated, or derailed, actually. He says, as a result of either sin or bad formation. And I think that's what we're basically saying. The bad formation is guys are never taught, or they're taught the wrong things, or they're taught to, you know, no, you just go make a bunch of money and then pay someone else to do this, which was considered in my day and age completely unmanly. You took care of your own stuff. The only time you asked somebody is if you needed them because you didn't know how to do it, or you couldn't do it, you know, because you didn't have the tools or what have you. But you actually just took care of things. And I think that but the other side of it is so guys aren't being taught, but then also guys are just lazy now. And so they just don't want to. Tools require a certain amount of effort, and guys just don't want to put it into it.
I admit I had never worked on a car before, but after reading the book, something happened with the car, and I immediately went, screw it, I'm going to see if I can fix this thing. Yeah. And it took me about 45 minutes, but I was like, we literally was able to pull off what we were supposed to do. It didn't get, now modern cars are a little bit more complicated than the old cars, so I needed to perform surgery to get the second step done. So I was like, all right, I'm taking it to the dealer for this one. But that point being made, going, yeah, you know, you should be able to do basic stuff on your vehicle too.
You should, yeah, basic stuff, or like if basic plumbing, a guy should be able to do just elementary plumbing, like changing the toilet if you need to, or something like that. It's you know, a lot of guys just can't. They don't. But it's not just that they don't know any tools. A lot of times they don't know anything about anything. So there's that.
Yeah, Mike Rowe talks about that in his books. And by the way, if anybody takes this advice and screws up their toilet, please do not send the bill to either of us. We're not responsible. This is entertainment purposes only.
Exactly. Yeah, in fact, I have a chapter in there just called "The Idiot," and that's what we're dealing with, right? Just people just don't know what they're doing. So,
but some of the virtues in that you bring up, it's just scattered all throughout the book. You bring up like reparations.
Yeah.
How did that incorporate into this?
Well, basically what I started noticing among some of the young kids today is the fact that people will create a mess, or they'll just really mess something up. I really noticed it when people would borrow stuff. They would trash the thing, and then they would just come back and hand it to you trashed and just say, sorry. Well, sorry doesn't cut it. The entire Catholic moral tradition has said that you have the obligation to restore this thing or give it back to me in a normal state, the state in which you got it, less normal wear and tear. And today kids have no sense of that. And so, and I started reflecting on, when did these things kind of happen? And so there was a story actually when, which is in the book. It's just called Reparation. And basically, I was working on this piece of equipment, and the next thing I notice is I'm getting whacked on the side of the face with oil, right? And I look up, and my brother is standing there with this oil can. Now, this oil can, I've seen a few of them kind of like it, but nothing was ever like this oil can. And I have a picture of one that's very similar to the one that we had. This thing, if you hit it just right, you could shoot oil about 15 to 20 feet with this thing. And it was designed in order to get up inside of engines so that you could oil specific, hard to get to parts, right? And this oil can was awesome. And so my brother was standing there about 10 feet away, whacking me with this thing, and of course grinning the whole time. And so once I realized that, typical kid, I try and grab another oil can. Of course, none of the other oil cans could ever shoot as far as this. So I went and shoot back at it and nothing would happen. In the meantime, my grandfather is sitting off on the side. Now, my father had gone to the bank, we think, to make a deposit. So my brothers and I were kind of having this exchange, right? And my grandfather is sitting over at his bench, just kind of watching this with a grin on his face, right? And so pretty quick, shortly after we kind of start this thing, my father comes in. And of course, there's oil all over the place. And my father just kind of walks in. He looks at us, looks at my grandfather. My grandfather's just grinning about the whole thing. So my dad just kind of looks back at us and just says, "Clean it up." And then he just, he went and he just continued doing what he was doing. And there's a couple of morals to this story. One is that when you get caught, sometimes the embarrassment of getting caught and then having to clean it up while everyone sits and watches you clean it up is actually more brutal as a punishment than actually if he would have punished us, right? So my father kind of knew that. The other side of it was too is that it was our obligation to clean up after ourselves. If you mess something up or if you create a mess, it's your obligation to clean it up, not leave it to somebody else, not just act like it doesn't exist. It's your place to clean it up. And that was one of the lessons that I actually learned in working around my father. In fact, there's a certain point in the book where I just mentioned the job isn't finished until the cleanup is done. And I think that's one of the things that people very often don't get is they'll finish something and they're like, "Oh, this is great." But then they leave tools laying around or they do this or that, which is always one of my big beefs. I mentioned that in the book is, especially as I got older as an adult, because at the shop, time was money. I mean, it really was money. How much, because we did not work by the hour except with certain jobs, because certain jobs would take a long time and we didn't know. So we'd tell the customer, "Well, we got to charge by the hour because we don't know how long this is going to take." But otherwise we'd do it by the job. And then that way we could actually charge them less than if you did it, if you charge them by time wise under normal circumstances, but we could get it done quicker and actually charge them and make more. So everybody came out kind of the winner in this whole situation. Well, that meant literally time was money. And so, if you didn't put a tool back exactly where you got it in the condition ready to go for the next guy, it just irked you off because you had to waste your time trying to do this when you should be working on the piece of equipment that you were going to be working on. And as an adult, I've come across that where people just don't clean up after themselves or they just throw stuff back, and it's all pure unadulterated laziness. And so that's one of the things I talk about in there is how it requires a certain amount of discipline to be a good mechanic and to work around other mechanics, because you actually have to, clean up after yourself, make reparation, especially if you messed something up. Well, it's your place to make it right, which I'll talk about here in a minute. But you also have to make sure that you're respectful of their time and their energy and what they would have to go through if you didn't do your job. And so you, which is something that's completely lacking today. People just don't seem to really care as long as it doesn't impact them. They just don't care. Whereas in here, I talk about the real impact that has on an individual's life. And so you would clean the tools up and always put it back. And I find that as I got older, people didn't always do that. But the other thing is, and this is something that always has bothered me, is, when I worked for my father, my father was an extraordinarily just man, and he was just, if we worked on something and the person took it home and it didn't work right, and we didn't actually, we thought we had fixed it, but we actually didn't actually address the real issue that he had brought it in for. If he brings it in for something else, that's another matter. But if he brings it in for that particular problem and we didn't fix it, we don't charge him again. We don't sit there and say, oh, well, it's going to be another 3 hours of labor for me to take a look at this. No, it's
Right.
our responsibility. I didn't do it right the first time. And because I charged him, I mean, if I didn't charge him, I'd say, well, I'm going to charge you now. But if we charged him, then it's my obligation to make it right now.
Right.
And you just don't see that. Even in, like, for example, recently I had a truck that I just didn't have the time to do the actual work on. Some parts and components on the drivetrain went out. I could have done it myself, but it would have taken too much time. And I just, as a superior, I just don't have that kind of time. So I took it in. They didn't do it right. I had to take it again, and they charged me again. And I'm like, okay, here's the money, but I'll never be back, because you didn't make it right the first time. And this is something that you're seeing along a lot of mechanic shops now, because the whole culture has changed. But this is the lesson that I point out in there. If you don't make it right the first time, it's your obligation to make it right. And this is something that you just don't see. So that whole story kind of begets that. But then there's also a story about a pack rat. I won't go into that. People can find a pack rat. So people can, and it has to do with the tools and making things right. So people can read about that.
I mean, it's a fun book. It's not, if you've read Fowler's other books, you don't need, not that you need a PhD in reading to get through the books, but it's and not to say this is a dumbed down book. This is a fun, entertaining reading. So you'll be able to read. You probably get through a 1 day sitting. Really, I did it in 2 or 3 days. So it's fun and enjoyable too. Plus, you get the stuff out. But yeah, when you were talking about, I remember going to the shop, and because it was that 2-part episode that I had, and I told him, here's the deal. Here's what's the problem. Here's what's going on right now. What's the charge? Well, we're going to need $300 for us to diagnose it. I just diagnosed it for you. I mean, if you come back saying that I was right, do I get my money back? No? Okay, I'm not coming next. But the discipline stuff you mentioned, just simply making the bed. You see the secular people talking about this all the time.
It's just clean up after yourself. I mean, you see people today, they just don't bother, and this is one of the, and part of that is just making it right for the next guy. Right. And it's which is kind of a sign that our society has really kind of succumbed to kind of a narcissism where it's all about me. And if it doesn't impact me, then I don't bother. The problem with this is, and this is something that as a mechanic, you can't get away with that, because eventually what goes around comes around. If you don't clean up after yourself, then the next project you have to work on, you might need that another tool, or you might need that area that you didn't clean up and know. So now you got to stop and clean it up, or to deal with it in order to be able to do your job. So eventually you just realize you got to clean up after yourself. You got to make it right. And you have to take other people's into consideration, which is just part of circumspection, but also it's just part of basic justice. I mean, it's not right to leave other people to have to clean up after you.
Yeah. Like, and you even bring up the time that would take to literally clean up a wrench. So maybe they did the effort to put it back, but they didn't put the effort to clean it up. And now you got to take the grease off or whatever, because after time you don't take care of your tools, you're going to have to need new ones.
Yeah, and it's all about making sure you put the tool back exactly where you got it from. And this is the reason for that is just because there's been times as an adult where people that I worked around didn't do that, and I would literally spend a half an hour hunting for a tool, and then I would ask, "Where is this?" "Oh, it's over here." "Well, did you finish using it?" "Yeah." "When?" 3 days ago." "Well, why didn't you put it back?" And then they kind of look at you like, why are you attacking me? I'm not attacking you. I'm asking you why you were lazy, basically, and didn't put the thing back. And this is part of fortitude as a man, and as I mentioned, discipline as a man, is that you clean up after yourself, and you do this so that the other guy doesn't have to deal with it, and not just go the lazy route and not clean up.
The theological idea is thinking, well, it's the a buddy of mine calls it the enforcement of the unenforceable, obedience to the unenforceable. be like no one's around you, but you dress nice or you talk well, or if you're
Yeah,
praying, you're in a proper position or you're paying attention and you're not
yeah.
being lazy in that sense. So if you're lazy in one, that would kind of do everything else that way.
Yeah, that's a really good point. When my father passed, shortly after he passed, one of the things that I was reflecting on is that both he and my mother taught us to do the right thing, regardless of whether it impacted other people. Now, that's one of the reasons I try and get people motivated to do it. But you did it simply because that meant that you were disciplined, you were rightly ordered, you were maintaining that right order and uprightness and virtue in the process, which also kind of comes out in the book too. But you should actually be doing these things independently of what other people think or do or how it's going to impact them. You should be doing it for that too, as a matter of justice. But in the end, you do it because it perfects you. It makes you a good person, not just because of other people. And so that was one of the things that I realized with my dad is that part of the way that we honor our parents is by maintaining that discipline.
Yeah, it's a reflection on them.
Yeah.
If
And it shows what kind of an individual we actually are. That's why when people say, it doesn't really matter what people wear, it doesn't really it doesn't reflect their character, this, that. Yes, it does. It completely reflects their character. Because if you see something like, for example, you walk into, and this is something that I've been been telling other people about, is like, for example, you go to an airport now and you go on an airplane. It's de rigueur that women are walking around in yoga pants. So basically, a priest or anybody really, any virtuous male has to be constantly practicing custody of the mind. And they say, well, it doesn't really say anything about the women. Yes, it does. It tells us that these women have no difficulty in revealing that degree of their lack of virtue in this area, and that it reflects on their own lack of interior discipline regarding these matters, that lack of modesty. That's what it shows, that this person lacks the virtue of modesty. Now they say, well, they don't know. That might be, but that ignorance, because you're ignorant, doesn't mean you have a virtue. They actually have to be working on this thing. But it's the same thing in relationship to, people. I don't know if you've ever seen, I'm sure you have, Steve, those pictures from people. And actually, you probably remember this because I remember this as a kid, and you growing up in the South, you probably remember this, is that, when people would just go shopping, they would actually dress up, in a suit and a tie or things like that, just to represent themselves as an upright individual. Today, people are just completely lack any kind of discipline in that regard. But
yeah,
anyway, that's a little bit aside. That's a little bit aside from the topic of the book.
yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
just on that, correct me if I'm wrong. I think the wait staff, you see with the ties and all,
yeah,
they dressed lower than what the people coming in were, but they're
yeah,
still dressed in the ties now. So it's kind of like it's flipped.
yeah. That's right. Yeah.
Uh,
But I think that's one of the things is that people say, well, it doesn't really matter what you wear. Yeah, it actually does, because it creates an image for us. It's the same thing with the lack of professionalism. And this is one of the things that when people would come into the shop, we would try to be very professional, and there was a specific way in which we would conduct ourselves in relationship to them. And this was in order to inspire them a confidence in our ability to do the job. So for example, when you get a stewardess who's doing the announcements over there and they're cracking jokes and carrying on and this and this, I want to just raise my hand and say, could you just knock it off? That you're not inspiring confidence that if this plane starts going down, that I can trust you to give me straight advice and seriousness about you actually knowing what you're doing. Because you're not being professional here. You're not showing me that you have a proper training and formation. You're just getting up there and trying to be a comedian. What you should be doing is, and this is why you should dress a certain way, you should conduct yourself a certain way, etc. But anyway.
Yes, I want to be on TikTok.
Yeah.
It kind of says one of the signs you guys had, not that this was a sign for TikTok or anything like that, but you kind of brought it up when we started, was the failure to plan ahead on your part does not constitute an emergency on our part. I'll try to get the sign in full view for people.
Yeah, my dad put that sign up. Yeah, that's the actual sign. You can actually go on Amazon, because for some of these, I thought, I'm going to just see if those things are still around, and they actually are. Of course, the labor rate charges have changed quite a bit, but that the reason we put that up is because a lot of times people would actually just come into the shop, and they would walk by, 10 days worth of equipment to work on and say, can you get to this right now? Or it's an emergency. I need to have this right now. Well, why do you need to have it right now? Well, the reason I need to have it right now is because of the fact that I haven't, mowed my lawn in 10 days and that city's getting on my case. Well, why didn't you do that? Well, I knew when I put this thing away back in October that it wasn't running right. And I'm like, well, why didn't you bring it in over the winter? Well, because I figured I'll just deal with it in the spring. Well, okay. So that's when my dad put this, failure to plan ahead on your, and this was in the book I talk. And so I draw the moral to the story out of it is this. The biggest problem we see in our culture, one of the biggest problems we see in our culture, not the biggest, but one of the biggest problems we see in our culture is some guy doesn't do his job or doesn't mess up, or he has some kind of need or thinks he has a need. Well, in that, he automatically presumes today, because of our entitlement mindset, and I talk about this in the book, that somehow or another, it's now someone else's responsibility to take care of what he didn't do. Right. So, the fact that this guy, he didn't, these guys, actually, there was numerous customers would bring stuff in and they didn't plan ahead. And so then now we're behind the 8 ball. And we literally would tell them sometimes it's going to be 10 days before we can get this. 10 days. Well, you can take it somewhere else, which they know they can't do because the other shops in town were more backed up than we were. So because we were really good at being able to get work done very quickly and efficiently. Well, it's the same, but you see the same problem. There's a shift in responsibility. They'll say things like, well, what am I going to do about my grass growing?
Yeah.
Well, that's not my monkey. The fact that you didn't mow your lawn and the fact that you didn't get this thing straightened out doesn't shift the responsibility to me to take care of it. And so this is something that I talk about in the book, is that our obligation is to take care of our own responsibilities and for us to plan ahead. But if we don't plan ahead, don't expect someone else to bail you out. And this is a kind of a lesson I just wanted to make sure that was in there. So these were kind of the things that we would learn. The other sign was of the labor rate sign, which was more of a joke, really, than it was anything else. In fact, that wasn't even our labor rate. But it's, although I think it was about $30 an hour at the time. This would have been in the 70s and about 80s. This would have been in the 80s. In fact, it was really funny because in the 80s, you'll like this story, Steve. So in the 80s, I get done working with my dad's shop and we charge about $30 an hour. I go to San Francisco and the labor rate for body work was $95 an hour. This was in the 80s. I'm like, whoa, wow. But anyway, getting back to it. So the first one was, basic labor rate. This is what we would charge people. And then the next one was, if you, I think the next one was, if you watch. And so, and this, that was more of a joke because people would watch us all the time because we would just, they would bring stuff in and then we would work on it right there in front of them. And that was actually a good lesson for me to learn. And it was a formational thing because I learned what it was like having other people watch over my work and inspecting my work without it impacting me as an individual. Yeah. It doesn't matter. I'm just doing my job. The fact that, in fact, there were times when we'd actually ask the customers to help us with stuff to certain degrees, but this was, it helped me to kind of learn the ability to kind of just be watched over without it impacting my ability to function or what have you. But there's a funny story about it. I'll leave it. People can read it about a woman whom this happened with. And she was panicking just a little bit because her husband was watching, etc. And then the next one was if you help. And part of this is because people are just going to get in the way. Right. But then the last one was if you worked on it first. And there's a couple of stories in here about that, where people would work on stuff first. And it just, as I mentioned in here, as a mechanic, and one of the things that you learn as a mechanic is basic logic, that and sequence, a logical sequence of certain things. You have to take off part A, then B, then C, then D, and E. And then from there, you can fix the thing, and then you have to go back, right? And so you actually learn there's a logical sequence. You also learn, as I talk about in the book, that certain parts fit other parts. So you learn the natures of certain parts fit certain other natures of other parts. So you just learn it built in a logic to you and your understanding of how logically things actually ended up working. Well, part of that is my dad was very intelligent when it came to being able to break down or to a tear down of a piece of equipment in the least number of steps possible to fix the thing and then put it back in that least number of steps, because the more parts you take off, the more you have to put back on in order to finish it. And so he would be extraordinarily good at doing this. Well, when people worked on the stuff themselves, they would literally bring this thing in a basket. I'm not exaggerating, in a basket, and it's disassembled to every single nook and cranny. And so it literally takes you twice as much time to put it back together than it should have, because they took too many parts off, or they didn't take the right parts off, or they took a lot of times, although we had worked on so much stuff so often that we could quickly assemble something regardless. But once in a while, people would bring us something in that we didn't see too often, and they would disassemble this thing. And now it took us more time to put it back together, because we had to actually look at the stuff and see, okay, this has to go here and this has to go here, rather than, as a mechanic, when you've worked on stuff numerous times, it becomes so habitual, you don't even think about the assembly. It just automatically goes together, and it's very rapid. It's very quick. Whereas if you have to sit and think about the thing, then it lengthens out the time. And so that's why we would say that.
One thing you mentioned about the people watching, I keep bringing up the problems with a bunch, especially in our circles, I think, is people take so much to heart. Every time someone says something negative about them or something bad happens, they get so bent out of shape. But if you play ball or you're in the military, you mentioned about cleaning up in front of people. You're in the military, you might have to, there's that famous scene from Full Metal Jacket, the guy scrubbing in front of everyone when, everyone else is scrubbing on the floor. He's eating a donut. And basically, I remember getting heckled in the stands, throw a strike, thanks. But you don't let that get your head, because you're going to get worse. Or in basketball, people talking smack to you. You got to keep that out of your head. Or your coach telling you, hey, motivating you in a different way than they probably get thrown out. Like, I was a Bob Knight fan. I mean, I love that. But we're so soft today that anything you say, you just get bent, as you say, twerked out.
Yeah. And that's actually one of the I'm not going to go into the particular episode, because I think it's something that I would really like people to read it, because it really does unpack something. And basically what it really does is, if you're a mechanic, and if you are trying to strive for any level of virtue whatsoever, but if you become a good mechanic, you basically have to have self-discipline and self-control over your emotions, and you can't let things get to you emotionally. And even because people would come in sometimes too, and they would chew us out or this or that for this, and it may or may not even be our fault. Most of the time it wasn't, but sometimes it was. And so we would say, okay, we'll straighten it out. We'll make it right. Other times it wasn't, but you still had to keep your head. You had to keep it cool. And this is, and what that does over the course of time is, when you keep your cool and keep your focus, people realize, okay, this guy, he's serious. He's going to get me straightened out. And then it mitigates their irritation with you, etc. But as a man, you learn to, and this is something I talk throughout the book, it's doing mechanical work can sometimes be physically painful, and it's fatiguing, and it's exhausting, but you learn to control your emotions, you control your appetites, your inclinations, by being able to work hard for long periods of time. And this is something which is something that's lost, I think, on the younger generation. And so there is that interior discipline that's just built into the process. If you're, and you can even apply to other areas of life if you want.
I bet that this was the case too. Failing the first time, you might not get it right the first time. Do you get mad, quit, or figure out what you did wrong and do better, and then you correct it? Then you got it stuck. You got the right way for the rest of the time.
Yeah, in fact, that's exactly right. And there's actually an episode in there too where I talk about how I thought I fixed something and I didn't get it right. And so, and that's one of the things that that's in the context of that episode. I won't talk too much about it because I want people to actually read it in there. But it's is that as a mechanic, you learn what you feel and what you think has no bearing on reality. Ultimately, that what really has to happen is you have to conform yourself to reality. And this is something which mechanical work does in spades. And it's not just mechanical work, working with tools in any area. Even like you said, resetting the pins and things like that. It's the reality. You might not want this thing to be out of whack, but that's just the way it's out of whack. So you have to do something in order to get it straightened out. And I think that this is true about any kind of trade. Ultimately, whether it's plumbing or mechanical or electrical work, it's the reality that has the bearing on the situation, not how you feel.
I like how you put out the logic of A, B, C, D thing, because most people are probably like, what if I can go around that thing, skip A, go to E,
Yeah,
and kind of like in a spiritual life. Oh, well, I won't worry about getting the sign of the cross down right, or the first 10, or know the 10 commandments. I'm just going to go right down to, let's get to the purgatory stage. How
yeah,
can I get to
exactly.
that without doing all this other stuff in between?
Yeah, yeah, and it's actually and it's in mechanical work. I mentioned that precision is everything in a certain sense, because you have to know precisely what the problem is, right? And there's an actual story in there where we diagnosed something, we didn't diagnose it right, and we warned the customer that we may not be right on our diagnosis, but he's still going to have to pay if we go this one route, and etc. And so, and there's a reason for why, which is in the book. But the point being is that it's precision is everything, and people think that they can just kind of half-baked stuff. I mean, the number of times we got equipment in where people were just jury rigging it, you're just like, wow, this is bad, And so, and a lot of times it's just, and that's another kind of a lesson that I talk about in there is, look, if you don't know what you're doing, don't do it. It's that kind of a thing.
Speaking
So
of character, even though we spoke about it a couple minutes ago, another chapter is really good was the dying the way you live.
yeah, but this is actually about the death of my grandfather. My grandfather, when I was in high school, I think it was, maybe it was in college, but he made this statement. He was talking about these nuns who were taking care of this guy who was dying in the hospital. And this guy he said the guy before he went into the hospital just swore like a drunken sailor. I mean, he just swore all the time, used profanity, vulgarities. And they said even when the guy was dying in the hospital, he was still using profanity and vulgarity. And my grandfather just made this statement: you die the way you live. Right. And so this is a really important lesson, because we tend to think, especially as Catholic, it's, as long as I'm good at the time in which I die, I'm okay. Well, you should be developing that, because how you're going to die is really based upon your virtues and vices at the time that you die. And that's based upon what you developed beforehand, right? Well, when my grandfather died, my grandmother called my father and said, you better get up here. And so my grandmother she comes up a couple of times in the book, and this woman was a serious woman. And so if she said something like that, it meant that he needed to drop everything. So he dropped everything, went up there to their home. And when she got her, he said, dinner's ready, but Lloyd doesn't want to come eat. So the Lloyd was my grandfather's name. So he goes back to the bed, and my grandfather's sitting there. And he had, my dad said, well, Mom wants you to come eat. And he says, well, I know, but I can't. He said, I'm too tired. I just want to lay down. He says, well, why don't you lay down? He says, well, I can't move my legs. So he said, well, so like basically my father, to make a long story short, helps my grandfather lay down. But it's at that moment that my grandfather passed, right? So it's kind of interesting, because up until that time, my grandparents actually had a very strong devotion to Our Lady. In fact, my grandfather used to wear his scapular at like a little lapel pin at times when he couldn't get it around his neck without it being a problem. So they were very devoted. My grandmother used to say the rosary all the time. And so, but when he died, just as my father is laying him down in his bed. Now you have to remember, my grandfather worked around my father probably for a majority of even my grandfather's life, because they had worked together on the farm before they bought the shop, and then they had worked together in the shop for about 40 some years, about 40 years, and well, it would have been about 37 years. But they worked together, and so there was this. They had worked around each other all their lives, and so and it was my father was my grandfather's only son, right? He had other siblings, but they were girls. And so when my father laid him down. He died. First of all, he dies in the arms of his only son, which is pretty cool, right? So he dies there. But just as he's about to die, as he laid, was my father laid my grandfather down in his bed. My grandfather looked up in the corner of the room, and my dad said his face completely changed. Now, I've actually, as a pastor, come across these cases a couple of other times in the past. There was one case where I was anointing a guy up in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. And after I anointed him, the parent, I left, and then the family said, because his eyes were completely glassed over. This guy looked like death incarnate. I mean, you could tell he was going to die. And so after I anointed him, I left. They said, shortly after I left, right immediately before he died, all of a sudden he looks up, his eyes go completely clear, like his normal color of his eyes come back, everything is normal, he gets this radiant face. And they said right after that, boom, he just died. Well, my grandfather looks up in the corner. My dad said his face completely changed, and he just said yes, and then boom, he's dead, right? And we think that this is one of the stories that are recounted in relationship to this, is that they actually see that there are some people at the time of their death actually see Our Lady come for them. And we wonder if that wasn't what happened with my grandfather because of that reaction, and then the fact that his death was so quickly after that. So, but it's a pretty cool story. But he died the way he lived. He had a devotion to Our Lady his whole life. He died if that's actually what happened. But then also he worked around my father, and so he ended up dying the way he lived, which is kind of interesting. There's more details in the story which people can read.
Yes, again, that's Shop Talk. The book's at Sensus Traditionalist Press, centradpress.com. The link will be in the show notes underneath. I got an autographed copy.
There you go. Yeah. And originally the first set that we ran had typographical errors, and we got those cleaned up. So the new version out, it's cleaned up. It's really good. It's funny, when I went to print, I never realized how expensive printing books that have pictures in it, because it's got pictures in it of the shop and parts of the shop. And so, but I couldn't realize how expensive it is. So we're not making much money off of this book, despite how expensive that it actually is on the internet. So in fact, we're not taking a loss, but we're not making much money off of the thing. But it's a picture book, and it's got a lot of stories in it. Gives people a kind of understanding of the formation that I went through in relationship to my father, as I mentioned, both in logic, philosophy, even basic life, etc.
And again, just your dad, he was a bowler, bowled a perfect game.
Yeah,
really enjoyed
well,
that.
there was one pin shy of a perfect game. And something that's in the book is I talk about the fact is that he was actually drafted as a pitcher for the Boston Red Sox.
Yes, I was going to bring that up, and I was if anybody is working with the Red Sox organization that can get more information to father on that.
Yeah, because his career got cut short due to an injury, and so, but we're convinced there has to be some file on him in their headquarters somewhere, and we would just love to be able to have like the original contract he signed and stuff like that, a copy of it, not the original, but the copies and things like that. If someone was able to get that would be fantastic.
I won't tell you who the famous guy they struck out, but
yeah, it's mentioned in the book. He struck out some pretty famous people, actually.
Anyway, Father, appreciate your time. Again, show notes, the book will be right there. Good read. Again, it's not a turn off your mind type deal thing. You'll get something out of it. It's just a fun read on the life of Father grew up. You get a background on where he is right now. So, and you might be working on cars by the end of it. Who knows?
Yeah, there you go.
Father, can you give everyone a blessing before you run?
Sure. Benedictio Dei omnipotentis, Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, super vos sit manet semper. Amen.
Thank you, Father. Have a good one.
You too.